The typically known General Motors LS2 engine debuted in the 2005 model year and generally made around 400 horsepower in most applications, 400 or 390 or 361 in the Pontiac G8 GT. But the LS2 was used in everything from Corvettes to GTOs and is generally regarded as a pretty good engine, as is really the entire suite of LS engines. The LS engine being introduced in 1997 and continuing through to this day, many people regard them as some of the best V8s that General Motors and Chevrolet has ever made, particularly those variants before the displacement on demand had come into vogue, because those really lasted 250, 300,000 miles with just normal maintenance and very, very little issues. They're really excellent engines. So if I'm very clearly lauding this engine, what in the world am I doing talking about it being one of the worst engines that General Motors has ever made? Well, of course, I am not referring to the LS2 that came out in 2005 that many people, including myself, regard as just an excellent engine. I'm referring to the first LS2 that General Motors produced. The first LS2? What in the world is that, you say? Well, there was the LS2 designation that was employed on an engine from General Motors before the beloved 2005 LS2 V8 that many of us know. And can you guess what it was bestowed upon? It was 1 year only. It was used for 1 year only in 1985. Well, 1 year only in 1985, the LS2 was used on the Oldsmobile-sourced 4.3-liter V6 diesel that was found under hood in the C cars of the time, the Cadillac DeVille and Fleetwood, the Buick Electra, and the Olds 98. Yes, that 4.3-liter V6 diesel that made 90 horsepower was christened the LS2, and only in those applications. The 4.3-liter V6 diesel as employed in rear-wheel drive applications and previously in the A-bodies like the Sierras, the Centuries, the 6000s, and the Celebrities had a different designation. But for whatever reason, GM decided to call that engine, when it's made its way into the C-bodies, the LS2. Now, I will admit that the 4.3-liter Oldsmobile V6 diesel that was optional in the C-bodies in 1985 only wasn't an absolutely horrible engine. You can tell it's a ringing endorsement that I have there. But GM had so destroyed the American public's perception of diesel engines by having introduced the Oldsmobile 350 cubic inch diesel in 1978. And it was introduced in everything from Cadillacs to Oldsmobiles to Buicks to Chevrolets to Pontiacs to even Chevrolet pickups. And overall, General Motors pickups, you get that Olds 350 diesel in it. And GM had a number of errors that they made associated with that engine. The first was that it had no water separator. And this is back at a time when diesel fuel wasn't as high quality as it is today. It would attract moisture, and then you get water in the fuel system. Well, water doesn't combust, and it also eats away at the injector pump seals and creates problems. So not having a water separator was really just a bad move on GM's part. I can only imagine they did that for cost savings. And they would eventually get it for, you guessed it, 1985 would be the year that the diesels would get a water separator. And that was the last year of all the diesels, the 5.7-liter as well as, by that point, the 4.3-liter V6 diesel. GM did also produce a 4.3-liter V8 diesel for 1 year only, 1979, and was offered only in Oldsmobiles. And that was another abysmal engine. But the lack of a water separator was a principal issue. And then another principal issue associated with this engine was they did not change the head bolt configuration from the standard gasoline engine. And you can imagine the clamping force that is required on an engine with 22.5 to 1 compression ratio compared to an engine that has, let's call it 8 to 1 compression ratio. It's just a lot greater. And so the head bolts would have a tendency to stretch. That would then blow the head gasket. And then, of course, once you blow the head gasket, bad things tend to happen. And I think third, people just didn't understand. They kind of touted diesels as being lower maintenance. You didn't have carburetors to adjust. They had mechanical fuel injection at this point. But they really weren't low maintenance, particularly on the oil changes. Diesel oil gets dirty very quickly. If you pull a dipstick on a diesel, even, let's say, 50 to 100 miles after you've changed the oil, at least one of these old school diesels, the dipstick's pretty dirty. It looks like the engine oil already has 1,000 miles on it. And that's just because of all the particulate matter that's produced from the diesel's combustion. And, well, that creates a number of challenges. If the oil isn't changed every 3,000 miles, you're going to be causing undue wear to the engine internals. And so I don't think that owners were quite as reliable as they should have been on the maintenance intervals with the diesels. GM decided not to have a higher capacity oil pan that could have carried more oil and thus would have helped, let's say, the oil in staying cleaner for longer. They just had the standard kind of 4.5 quart oil pan in these diesels too. So that didn't do it any favors. So it's really a shame. I would say for 1978, there was also one more Achilles heel, and that was that they did not have the fast start glow plugs for 1978. Those would be introduced in 1979. And so in 1978, if you went out to start your car and it was 0 degrees outside, you were waiting for 90 seconds to a couple minutes for the glow plugs to preheat the combustion chambers. And can you imagine being outside in 0 degree weather, just with the key on, sitting there waiting to start your car? That had to have been very aggravating. Thankfully for 1979, the fast start glow plugs really assisted with that particular scenario, and the wait times dropped to 6 to 7 seconds at 0 degrees Fahrenheit. So they were much better from 1979 on, and the cars did start okay. But it was really the lack of a water separator, the poor head bolt design, or really just reusing the head bolt design from the gas engine. And those things nullified the incremental improvements that Oldsmobile had made to the block, the crankshaft. Everything was forged really on the internals, from the connecting rods to the crankshaft. It was a relatively strong engine, but not the upper end of it, and not the clamping force on the head bolts. And so when Oldsmobile went to design the 4.3-liter V6 diesel, there was no Oldsmobile 4.3-liter V8. And so it was a little bit of a clean sheet diesel, although they still did want to employ some of the machining processes from the V8. But the V6 diesel was designed to be produced in its own assembly plant, the Delta Diesel plant. Oldsmobile even produced this engine in its own dedicated facility. They thought that there was going to be enough production volume on the V6 diesel to warrant an entire assembly plant being dedicated to it. And, well, you know how that ended, especially after 1985 when they canceled the program. The 4.3-liter V6 diesel was certainly better than the 5.7 and the 4.3-liter V8 diesels, but they still did have some head gasket issues. They did have a water separator in 1985 on the so-called LS2 V6 diesel, but overall it still was not as reliable of an engine as the gasoline engines that it was replacing. It did get really good fuel mileage, I have to say that. So that was one thing that was definitely beneficial for the 4.3-liter V6 diesel. But other than that, this is one of those engines in General Motors history that, let's just say, goes down in a bit of infamy. And the one-year-only LS2, I have no idea why General Motors chose LS2 for the 4.3-liter V6 diesel. It wasn't like previous diesels had been designated LS1. That was not true. Somehow they picked LS2 for it. And I guess when Chevrolet reintroduced the LS2 in 2005, they probably just chose to forget about the original LS2, or maybe somebody did completely forget about it because nobody made any mention of it. But that is the true story of the 4.3-liter V6 diesel. It's kind of like how Lincoln forgot about the Mark III 4.5 from 58, 59, and 60 when they reintroduced the Mark III in 1969. It was almost as though those prior cars were just forgotten. So what do you think? Did I pick the worst engine of General Motors of all time, the LS2? No, not the 2005 LS2 V8, but this 4.3-liter V6 diesel. If you have a nomination, put a comment in the comment section. Let me know what you think. Thanks again for watching, and until next time, take care.